My biggest regret, looking back at my younger years, is how many hours I spent with my ear glued to radios like RFI and France 24. At the time, I thought I was staying informed, that I was keeping my mind sharp, but in truth, I was being fed a carefully prepared diet. Stories chosen for me, interpretations decided for me, truths trimmed and polished until they fit neatly into someone else's agenda. And then, one day, I heard Ibrahim Traoré speak. He wasn't just giving a speech, he was instructing, almost as if he were handing us, a blueprint for liberation. No vague slogans, no well-rehearsed diplomacy, just a raw, unapologetic breakdown of what Africa must do, how it must do it, and the price it will pay if it doesn't. The setting was symbolic. Russia was marking the 80th anniversary of victory over Nazism, a reminder of a nation that had survived not only the fires of war, but also decades of isolation and sanctions. While other leaders shook hands and posed for cameras, Traoré used the moment to say something uncomfortable, something precise. Africa must fight imperialism the way Russia did, with preparation, with self-reliance, with the will to survive even when cut off from the lifelines of the empire. To the casual listener, it might have sounded like political theater, a rallying cry to excite the crowd, but the timing, the phrasing, the context, they revealed something more calculated. This was not about aligning with Russia or provoking the West for sport. It was about method, about survival, about teaching African nations that waiting for mercy is a trap, and that real independence begins the moment you can live without the empire's approval. So here's the question. In a world where the weak are exploited and the dependent are controlled, can Africa truly stand without the empire's hand? And if a young leader from a small, landlocked country dares to say yes, do we have the courage to believe him? Or will we keep listening to the voices that have always told us no? When Ibrahim Traoré spoke in Moscow, it wasn't to flatter his hosts or to strike a symbolic pose. It was to deliver a very deliberate lesson. In his view, Africa's battle against imperialism isn't just about expelling foreign troops or refusing aid. It is about learning how to survive when the empire tries to suffocate you. And for that, he pointed to one of the most sanctioned, demonized, and isolated nations of the modern era, Russia. For most of the 20th century, Russia was forged in the crucible of crisis. From the Second World War to the Cold War, from economic collapse in the 1990s to the sanctions tsunami of 2022. Each time, the West predicted the same outcome: total collapse. When the most recent sanctions hit, every Western economist lined up to forecast the fall of the ruble, the implosion of industry, and the eventual public revolt. But none of that happened. Instead, Russia did something that most African countries have never dared to attempt. It built alternatives. Critical industries were localized, production chains were moved inside national borders, and vital sectors, energy, defense, agriculture, were fortified against outside control. Strategic partnerships were forged beyond Europe and North America, and, crucially, Russia tied its currency to real resources, oil, gas, and minerals, rather than to promises or debts denominated in someone else's money. Whether one supports or opposes Russia politically is irrelevant here. Traoré's point was not to copy Russia's foreign policy or military strategy, but to understand its survival logic. Independence, he argued, requires self-sufficiency even when the cost is isolation. Negotiations only have meaning when you already hold the means to survive without your opponent's consent. Leverage, in his view, is not built at summits or donor conferences. It is built in the ability to feed your people, fuel your industries, and defend your borders without the empire's lifeline. This is where, according to Traoré, Africa has historically failed. The continent's default reaction to pressure, whether in the form of sanctions, donor withdrawals, or economic crises, has been concession. Governments shrink their ambitions, accept conditionalities from the IMF or World Bank, and wait for aid that comes with more strings than solutions. This pattern, he warned, is not a sign of diplomacy. It is a symptom of dependency. He contrasted this with the path taken by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in recent years. By rejecting the conventional model, looking to Europe for funds, to the U.S. for security, and to global institutions for validation, they have not collapsed. Instead, they have begun, as he put it, to detox from the system that keeps African nations in a permanent state of managed poverty. The Russian example, for Traoré, is not about admiration for Moscow's politics. It is about proof that survival without the West is possible, that a nation can be sanctioned, demonized, and cut off, and still function, still grow, still hold its sovereignty. The lesson is stark. If you prepare for isolation before it comes, you can turn it into a weapon against those who imposed it. And for a continent like Africa, with its vast resources and youthful population, the potential is even greater. The challenge, he insists, is to shift from reacting to pressure toward anticipating it, building the systems, industries, and capacities that will make the empire's threats meaningless. Because once you can live without their help, their power over you disappears. For many in the room, it was an uncomfortable message. For others, it was a revelation. And for those who have spent their lives hearing that Africa cannot survive without the empire's hand, it was a direct challenge. If Russia can do it under the weight of global sanctions, what excuse does Africa have? The turning point in Traoré's speech came when his tone shifted from analysis to warning. The polite historical parallels faded. The measured explanations gave way to a blunt truth. If a country is weak, it is doomed to disappear in this world of predators. There was no metaphor here, no poetic cushion for the message. It was a factual statement, delivered without a hint of consolation. In global politics, weakness is not tolerated. It is exploited. Fragile nations are not left alone. They are targeted, drained, and discarded. Traoré spelled it out. The world does not pity the weak. It uses them. It sells them protection and calls it aid. And if that fails, it replaces their leaders, dismantles their systems, and installs new puppet regimes to keep the cycle going. He connected this directly to Africa's lived reality. When a country relies on foreign fertilizer for its food supply, it can be starved without a single soldier crossing its borders. When its weapons are purchased from the very powers it might one day resist, its defense is already compromised. When its ports, currencies, and supply chains are dictated by former colonial powers, its sovereignty is an illusion. This is why, Traoré argued, every inch of dependency is a crack in the wall. A nation that depends on its rivals for essential needs does not need to be invaded. It only needs to be denied access to what keeps it alive. And that, he warned, is the core of the empire's strategy: to control without occupying, to dominate without marching in. It is also why he has rejected foreign security deals, turned down donor aid, and pushed for military self-training in Burkina Faso. Not because he is an isolationist, but because he understands that capacity, not sentiment, not moral correctness, is the currency of survival. In a world of predators, only the strong can dictate their own terms. And here is where the reaction comes in. From Paris, the criticism was swift. French President Emmanuel Macron dismissed Burkina Faso's path as the product of Russian influence, framing it as an imported ideology rather than an indigenous strategy. Western media headlines began to describe the country as unstable, authoritarian, and military-ruled, language carefully chosen to evoke fear and disapproval, especially among foreign audiences and the African diaspora. This, Traoré pointed out, is not a spontaneous misunderstanding. It is information warfare. The aim is to isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically, to discredit its leadership, and, most dangerously, to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of its own citizens. In this battle, The weapon is not a missile, but a story. It's the same tactic that has kept African nations psychologically tethered to their former colonizers. Even after the soldiers leave, the narrative remains. And in many cases, it is that narrative, not the reality on the ground, that shapes policy, alliances, and public opinion. For older generations in Africa, the smear campaigns might sound familiar. But for younger Africans, many of whom consume most of their news through Western platforms, the risk is greater. Traoré lamented that too many still trust France 24, BBC, or RFI more than they trust their own community's lived experiences. They do not realize that the story being told about them is not neutral. It is crafted to maintain the very system they think they understand. As he spoke, the urgency in his voice was clear. This was no longer about the mechanics of survival. It was about the final frontier of liberation, the mind. Because if Africa succeeds militarily and economically but fails to free itself from the empire's narrative, then it has not truly won. It was here, at this emotional high point, that the audience felt the weight of his message. Strength, Traoré insisted, is not a choice for nations that want to exist. It is a necessity. And in a world where the empire still writes the story, Africa's fight will not only be on the battlefield or in the factory, it will be in the newsroom, in the classroom, and in the minds of its people. When Burkina Faso began charting its independent course, rejecting foreign military presence, refusing conditional aid, and asserting control over its borders, the move was more than symbolic. It set in motion a series of transformations that have begun to reshape both the daily life of its citizens and the political architecture of the region. On the civilian level, the shift is most visible in the change of mindset. For decades, the dominant narrative was that small African nations could not survive without the political, military, and economic backing of former colonial powers. This belief, reinforced in schools, media, and government rhetoric, had seeped so deeply into the public consciousness that dependency felt natural, even necessary. But the policies, championed by Traoré, have begun to chip away at that mental framework. In rural communities where the presence of foreign troops once seemed permanent, there is now a sense of reclaimed space. Local initiatives, from community farming projects to small-scale manufacturing, are no longer framed as stopgap measures but as building blocks for a sustainable economy. That shift in perception is critical. Once people believe they can survive without an external lifeline, they begin to demand more from their own institutions. And with that demand comes political pressure for competence, transparency, and results. Qualities often dismissed as luxuries in countries struggling under the weight of foreign-imposed priorities. On the political level, the consequences have been even more striking. Burkina Faso's stance has helped catalyze the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, alongside Mali and Niger. This bloc, united by shared grievances and strategic goals, is more than a loose diplomatic grouping. It represents a coordinated rejection of the old model of fragmented, donor-dependent governance. By pooling security resources, harmonizing certain economic policies, and speaking with a collective voice on the international stage, AES countries have created a counterweight, however modest, to the influence of France, the EU, and other external actors in the Sahel. For the first time in decades,